Welcome to our latest explainer. Today we are diving into a truly mind-bending legal premise. I want you to imagine a massive, globally recognized G7 nation. It's functioning day-to-day with laws, courts, a federal government, the whole shebang, but theoretically, it might be operating on a totally shaky or even non-existent legal foundation. We're exploring a fascinating historical and legal argument that suggests exactly that about Canada. We're going to unpack some really thought-provoking historical records and theories to see how this incredible mystery came to be.
So, I want to pose this direct question to you right out of the gate. Is Canada actually a country without a constitution? Now I know, on the surface, that sounds like a ridiculous question, but it's actually a deeply complex legal paradox. In fact, it's a topic that modern political channels like the Canada Truth YouTube channel are actively debating today. They argue that the government has basically been ignoring critical historical documents that essentially nullify their authority. We're going to look strictly at the source material and the historical timeline they reference to understand exactly how this massive legal loophole theoretically opened up.
To really wrap our heads around this, we have to look at this incredible quote from Walter F. Kuhl. Kuhl was a member of Parliament from Alberta, serving from 1935 to 1949, and in a 1977 booklet, he used this brilliant analogy. He argued that Canada's original confederation started out as a forced shotgun marriage under British rule. But after a massive legal shift in 1931, that relationship completely changed. As Kuhl put it, ever since 1931, the provinces have essentially just been living in a common law relationship with Ottawa. And the kicker? They have the right to terminate that arrangement at any time.
All right, let's jump right into part one, the constitutional mystery.
To really grasp Kuhl's analogy, we need to understand the core of his legal thesis, which he laid out in his provocatively titled booklet, Canada, a Country Without a Constitution. He presented an argument claiming the Canadian federal government has literally been in a state of legal anarchy for nearly a century. He argued that all power to govern actually resides with the individual provinces, and it stays there until the provinces officially sign an agreement to delegate those powers back to a central government. According to Kuhl's reading of history, Canada essentially sleepwalked past its own independence. Because a formal, domestically ratified agreement was never signed by all the provinces after 1931, this theory suggests Ottawa has been operating without legitimate, fully delegated constitutional authority ever since.
Moving on to Section 2, Colony versus Dominion.
To understand how such a huge legal loophole could even theoretically exist, we have to look at how the British Empire categorized its territories. Historically, a united colony meant a territory was administratively joined together, like merging Upper and Lower Canada, but legally, it was subordinate to Britain. Britain held the ultimate legal authority and could just override local laws. A united dominion, on the other hand, is fundamentally different. It's politically joined but legally independent. It controls its own foreign policy, and its parliament is equal to Westminster. The word united just describes the internal structure, but the transition from a colony to a dominion, that is where the actual sovereignty shifts hands.
Which brings us to Section 3, the 1931 legal loophole.
This is the absolute catalyst for Walter Kuhl's entire argument, the 1931 Statute of Westminster. Let's trace this timeline for a second. Back in 1867, you have the British North America Act, or the BNA Act. We often think of this as Canada's creation, but strictly speaking, it was just a British statute uniting colonies. The actual authority still rested in London. Fast forward to the 1926 Balfour Declaration. This was a political agreement stating dominions were equal in status. But it wasn't until the 1931 Statute of Westminster that this became actual binding law. This statute officially severed the imperial enforcement mechanism.
So what did the 1931 statute actually accomplish? Three massive things. First, it removed Britain's veto power over the dominions. Second, it gave dominions full legislative freedom to pass their own laws. And third, it repealed an old 1865 act that used to void colonial laws if they clashed with British ones. This document is widely considered the legal birth certificate for modern nations like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. It legally transformed them from subordinate colonies into fully sovereign nations.
But here is Kuhl's brilliant and highly provocative deduction. Because the original BNA Act of 1867 was a British law, the very moment Britain severed its legal ties in 1931, the legal route of the federal government was cut. Kuhl argued that the British Parliament essentially relinquished its sovereign rights, and, by default, those rights fell directly to the provinces, not to the federal government in Ottawa. Without a newly drafted, domestically ratified constitution, sovereignty just kind of landed right in the laps of the provinces.
Now, this leads us to Section 4, the British Court Paradox.
If you're thinking this is all just some abstract legal theory, consider this number for a second, 18.
For 18 years after becoming a supposedly fully sovereign nation in 1931, Canada was still exporting its most important legal questions to a British court.
That's right, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, or JCP, located in London and made up primarily of British judges, remained Canada's absolute highest court of appeal until 1949. The Supreme Court of Canada was actually subordinate to it. Think about what a glaring contradiction that is. You have a legally equal sovereign nation, but the final word on Canadian law is happening across the ocean. And because cases that were already pending were allowed to finish up, the final JCP ruling on a Canadian case didn't actually happen until 1959. This paradox strongly reinforces Kuhl's argument that Canada's legal independence in 1931 left a massive, unresolved vacuum in practice. Let's fast forward a bit to Section 5, the 1982 patriation problem. To try and finally fix this missing domestic authority, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau pushed for patriation in 1982. It's really important to delineate what actually happened here. On one side, you have the Constitution Act of 1982, which is the overarching legal framework. This gave Canada the power to amend its own constitution without having to ask Britain. On the other side, embedded inside of it, is the famous Charter of Rights and Freedoms. A great analogy for patriation is that it was kind of like transferring the deed to a house without physically moving the house itself. The physical document stayed in Britain, but the legal authority to change it finally moved to Canada.
But here is where Kuhl's tension flares up again, and honestly, it remains unresolved today. The 1982 Constitution is legally binding, yes, but politically, it is highly contested, because the province of Quebec never formally endorsed it. The agreement was made entirely without Quebec's signature. As a result, Quebec operates under it, but heavily relies on the Section 33 notwithstanding clause to override certain rights. It acts as an ongoing protest against a framework it never explicitly agreed to. So we literally still have a constitution operating without universal provincial consent.
Let's bring this all together in Section 6, Alberta's sovereignty argument.
If we apply Kuhl's logic specifically to the province of Alberta, a really compelling legal framework emerges. Let's walk through the logical steps of this chain together. Step 1. The original framework, the BNA Act, was just a British statute. Step 2. In 1931, the Statute of Westminster severed that legal route. Britain bowed out. Step 3. Because Canada never held a constituent assembly to draft a new domestic agreement, sovereignty defaulted to the provinces. And Step 4. The 1982 Constitution didn't fix this foundational issue because it lacked the formal consent of all the provinces. Therefore, under this specific theory, sovereignty was never legitimately transferred back to Ottawa.
When we look at Alberta specifically, the argument gets even stronger with these 3 points. First, the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement of 1930, which is often called Alberta's real constitution, gave Alberta sovereign control over its resources. Crucially, this happened just 1 year before the 1931 legal split severed Ottawa's British authority. Second, Alberta was created by federal statute in 1905. It never actively consented to join Confederation like the original colonies did. And third, the Supreme Court's 1998 secession reference actually ruled that if a province holds a clear referendum on sovereignty, Ottawa is legally obligated to negotiate. All of this ties back to what's known as the compact theory of confederation. Basically, this is the legal theory that a federation is fundamentally a treaty or an agreement between sovereign entities, rather than a system unilaterally imposed from above. Kuhl's argument rests heavily on this exact idea. If we accept this theory, imposing a federal structure onto Alberta, a province manufactured by Ottawa in 1905 with no original voice, completely lacks legitimate constituent consent, especially after those imperial legal ties were finally cut in 1931.
Well, that brings us to the end of our explainer, but I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Can a constitution be legally operative even if its origins are fundamentally contested? Now, the Supreme Court of Canada operates as if the answer is yes, treating the Constitution as legally binding despite these historical gaps. But, as Walter Kuhl pointed out decades ago, and as modern commentators absolutely continue to highlight today, the tension between strict legal legitimacy and day-to-day political reality in Canada is a mystery that has never been perfectly solved. Thanks so much for joining me as we unraveled this incredible historical puzzle.